Okay, so welcome everybody to our Caribbean Studies seminar. My name is Dr. Eve Hayes de Calaf, and I'm the convener of this seminar series. It gives me great pleasure today to welcome Professor David Lambert, who will be talking to us on his new book. But just by way of introduction, well, just firstly say that this session is being recorded. So if you do have a question you want to ask at the end of the talk, just be aware that if you ask a question, you will be recorded. Otherwise, please put the question in the chat. So David Lambert is Professor of Caribbean History at the University of Warwick, where he is also the co-director of the Yesu Persaud Centre for Caribbean Studies, and his books include Soldiers of Uncertain Rank, the West India Regiments in British Imperial Culture, which he'll be talking to us about today. He's also one of the editors of the journal Slavery and Abolition and is former editor at Atlantic Studies Global Currents. And he's currently working on a new project, campaigning and counter-insurgency in the Creole archipelago. So, and this is a project that examines the British experience of counter-revolutionary warfare in the Caribbean in the 1790s. So, David, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Eve. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to the seminar. As you said, the title of the talk is the title of the book that came out at the end of last year. I'm not a military historian, and I might touch on that about military history in the Caribbean because it's something that I've become kind of interested in. And this particular book was part of a Arts and Humanities Research Council funded project called Africa's Sons Under Arms, which colleagues at Warwick did with collaborating with colleagues at the British Library, and we also worked with the Museum of London Docklands to put an exhibition on. So I'd just like to kind of acknowledge that's the context for this. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to start with the front cover of the book and this painting. So this is a painting that's basically acquired by the National Army Museum in 2018, and it dates from the early 1800s to 1802, 1803, not exactly sure. And it depicts a private from the 8th West India Regiment. The little green plume on his helmet, on his headgear, shows he's a member of the Light Company. So this is basically one of the two flank companies of a British regiment. And in theory, the Light Company were the smallest and quickest men. So these are the ones who are kind of, they're given jobs of kind of skirmishing and kind of reconnaissance and stuff like that. And the private is standing, he's not just standing in a kind of random way, standing in a very particular way, standing to attention. He's presenting arms, which is one of a series of the kind of drills of the British Army at this period, as though he's performing a kind of manual drill. And in a sense, we, the viewer looking upon him, that's the role. We're kind of like the commanding officer gazing upon this man and seeing whether he's performing his manual drill correctly. You can see in the background some tents of some vague figures in uniform, some ships, and some palm trees to denote that this is the Caribbean. And there are going to be a lot of palm trees. And now there's an argument there about why there's a lot of palm trees in some of these images. Now, there's nothing particularly unusual about images of British Army personnel from the Revolutionary and Napoleonic periods, including just kind of ordinary rank and file. What is unusual, of course, is the man's ethnicity, or more unusual is the man's ethnicity. For those of you who don't know, the West India Regiments, multiple, were established from the mid-1790s, and they were part of the regular British Army, and that's something that's really important to understand. These aren't kind of colonial auxiliaries or anything like that. They are part of the British Army until 1927. They bring together a series of existing units, so some African-American men who'd fought for the British during the American Revolutionary War, also a series of formerly enslaved men who'd been raised by French royalists in Martinique and Guadeloupe. But most of these men who fill these regiments are bought from traders and enslaved people. Now, we don't know who this man is, or indeed who painted him, but he's presented as a soldier. It's not a caricature. It's a kind of fairly naturalistic portrait. It's not that big. And crucially, it represents possibly one of the two earliest images of the West India Regiments. And from the very beginning, it sort of serves to represent a particular kind of way in which the regiments are always depicted, a particular discourse that's there from the start. Now, if we move on more than 100 years, so this is an image from 1912. And this is a very different sort of image. This appears in this is a published image rather than one that was just a painting. And it appears in something called the Boy's Own Paper, which is one of these examples of kind of late Victorian, early Edwardian, imperial juvenilia, like boys and guns and war and empire type magazines that are very common in this period. And by this time, by the 1910s, there's only one West India Regiment left. And you can see him, I picked him out of the crowd with a kind of yellow arrow. The uniform he's wearing is very different. He's wearing a uniform that was inspired by the French Zouave soldiers who were kind of highly emulated from the mid-19th century onwards. And indeed, it's in the late 1850s that style is adopted by the West India Regiments. By the 1910s, though, that's pretty much like a bygone leftover of a much earlier age. If you look at some of the soldiers around him, there were people wearing khaki. This is post-Anglo-Boer War, but this man is still dressed in this kind of exotic leftover. Another difference between this image and the earlier one, of course, is that this man is in a crowd. And these types of collective martial images that always make me think of something like Sergeant Pepper's, it's that type of image, become very common from the late 19th century especially. They're part of a kind of emergence of a mass militarized culture that you get in kind of collectible cards, toy soldiers, jingoistic literature, and lots of military parades. Now, whilst in a sense, what the purpose of this image here is to kind of display, put a positive spin on the kind of hierarchies of empire. This is like unity in diversity, all these different people together fighting for king and country. The fact that this West India Regiment soldier is in this particular crowd is a visual sleight of hand, because unlike, for example, the Trinidad Light Infantry or the Victoria Ranger, who again I've highlighted here, they are colonial auxiliary forces. But the West India Regiment is not. He's a member of the British Army, and yet he's in amongst this crowd. He's in a company that he does not belong in. And that might sound like a minor military quibble, but it's not. His presence here exemplifies, I would argue, the increasing marginalization of these units particularly from the second half of the 19th century onwards, but also points to a kind of fundamental ambiguity about the status of these men, their uncertain rank from the start. Despite the differences, there are some similarities between the images that it's also worth stressing. The earlier portrait can be placed within a kind of long-standing proto-ethnographic tradition that goes back to the Renaissance of how non-European peoples are represented. And likewise, the text that accompanies the later image, which talks about types of our empire's defenders, evokes a kind of anthropological perspective. So there's a kind of ethnographic anthropological thing going on that's common. Moreover, both privates stand in formal poses as though ready for inspection, rather than kind of in a relaxed posture or in any kind of doing anything military in a kind of military fashion. And this, I think, is because there's a thing going on here, which is that the martial value of the West India regiments had to be continually reassessed. And this is something you see throughout the kind of visual and textual representation of the units. It had implications for how they were viewed by the wider British public, and it also had implications for how they were used militarily. So basically, the book Soldiers of Uncertain Rank is concerned with this kind of changing image across the long 19th century of soldiers of African descent, and specifically of the West India regiments. As I said, prior to the formal ending of Britain's involvement in the trade in enslaved people, the bulk of recruits are purchased from traders in enslaved people. Later, so-called liberated Africans, freed by the Royal Navy, become an important source of recruits. And throughout their history, until at least till the end of the 19th century, they're always commanded by white officers, and indeed are often talked about in highly paternalistic ways, as if they almost like embody a kind of idealized racial hierarchy. At the same time, the soldiers of the West India regiments existed in complex relations with other people of African descent, be that the enslaved people of the Caribbean or formerly enslaved civilians later on, or indeed various groups of African peoples after the regiments began to serve in that part of the world as well. As such, the West India regiments held a I think, a very ambiguous place within a whole series of British military and imperial discourses. And that's one thing the book is about. It argues that the West India Regiment serves a kind of lens to think about a whole series of debates across the long 19th century about things like slavery and freedom, racial difference and Britishness, savagery and civilisation, as well as ideas about heroism and service. So during their existence for more than 130 years, the regiment's soldiers serve across the Caribbean, including what's now Belize and Guyana. They participate in the War of 1812, the Battle of New Orleans. And then from the 1820s, they're also serving in West Africa. There are 12 regiments at their peak. And from 1888, there's a single regiment left. And the final regiment is disbanded in 1927. There's some interesting talk about bringing them back during the debate about West Indian Federation. But that doesn't come to pass. And throughout their history, the kind of martial capabilities of the soldiers is constantly questioned. At the beginning of their history, this is evident in very, very powerful opposition to the creation of the regiments, particularly from white West Indian planters and colonists, who see them as a threat rather than as a kind of source of stability and safety. But even later on, as those kind of sort of sentiments has passed from the 1830s onwards, there are still many figures, including senior military figures, who continue to express deep skepticism about the regiments. So in the book, then, I explore this changing visual and textual image of the regiments. And as such, the book is situated at the confluence of a kind of couple of areas I've worked on before, so kind of cultural histories and imperial histories, but then it also brings kind of military history into that. And as I said before, I'm not a military historian, though I've become convinced, and I say this in the book, and apologies to anyone who is a military historian who happens to be here, military history is too important to be left to just to military historians. One of the things that's really interesting when you read a lot of political, social, cultural, and economic history, say of the late 18th century Caribbean, is you don't really get a sense, unless you're looking at specifically Saint-Domingue, that there's a massive global war going on. It's almost, I think a lot of historians don't really think about that as if it's as an important part of what they're studying. I think it is. Now, a really useful concept, and one that I hope gets a lot more traction because I think it's really helpful, is a concept that was articulated by an American academic guy called Scott Miley, called military spectacle. And he published this, it was based on his doctoral thesis, he published the book. I just don't think it got picked up. It was perhaps a little bit too early for what's now the kind of debates at the confluence of cultural and military history. But basically, this idea of military spectacle is what Miley uses to talk about the kind of particular forms of clothing, equipment, badges, flags, music, ceremonies, rituals, forms of address, forms of bodily deportment that are associated with the military. And these elements are experienced by soldiers every day, of course. And Miley argues that the kind of manipulation of military spectacle was crucial to managing army discipline and morale, and was also crucial to the recruitment of men into military units through appeals to kind of ideas of male prowess, patriotism, and idealism. And military spectacle, particularly the uniform, served to mark the soldier off from the wider population. And of course, it's also brought to wider public attention through reviews and pageants. And as these two examples show you, is also represented in a range of visual forms. In other words, this concept of military spectacle allows us to sort of think about the kind of strong psychological and emotional influence on the soldiers themselves, but also on how they're viewed by other people, how people looking at them think about them. So the military spectacle of the West India Regiments is a focus for a range of kind of interventions and projects and discourses that are directed towards the soldiers themselves and are crucial to the way in which there are efforts to kind of fashion the men of the West India Regiments into martial subjects. And this brings us to the painting, the first image I showed you. The decision to dress the men in what was essentially the military spectacle of the foot regiments that made up the bulk of the British Army in this period was part of a kind of calculation by the British military authorities by which they sought to manage and secure at least the compliance, if not the loyalty, of these black soldiers to their cause. And this is taking place at a time, this is why context is so important. This is taking place at a time in the 1790s when a much wider set of freedoms and liberties are being seized by people of African descent and given to people of African descent. So these regiments are being created at exactly the time when Poverel and Sontonax are trying to align the French Republican cause with the cause of liberation in Saint-Domingue, trying to bring Toussaint across. This is at exactly the same time when Fedon is mobilizing people in Grenada, where we've got wars out in St. Vincent, in Saint Lucie. So there are kind of a wider set of freedoms that are being grabbed and kind of by people of African descent in the Caribbean. And the consequences for the British as the kind of primary counter-revolutionary force in the Caribbean is that this is an act of military desperation. Their forces are being beaten back across the region. They're crippled by disease. And in that context, this image needs to be understood as almost as radical a step as it's possible to imagine a pro-slavery counter-revolutionary power to take. This is, I would argue, a kind of a spectacular and symbolic gift in lieu of more substantive freedoms. So this is as far as the British could imagine going, is bringing people into their own army to defend the wider system of racial slavery across the region. Now, of course, a question that often gets asked me is, did the men internalize British military discipline? And of course, the problem we always have there is that the perspective of the soldiers themselves is almost impossible to access. So too often we have opinions that are allotted to them, particularly by their officers. And as such, while military subalterns, or at least commanding officers, speak freely, the ordinary soldiers' views remain private. But archival silence is clearly not passivity. There's a really good work by Eric Jan Zerker, which talks about how we should think about soldiers as labourers and think about as a form of labour. And he argues in that book that soldiers had agency, that life in the army offered opportunities for social advancement or material betterment, escape from what he calls issues at home, or the chance to travel beyond one's immediate locale. And while such forms of expansive agency were certainly not available to West India Regiment soldiers at the beginning of the history because of the way that these men had been brought into the regiments, they were certainly not passive. And I think it's highly suggestive that the first mutiny, there's 3 mutinies that take place amongst the West India Regiments, which is not very many in the courts given how long they last. But the very first mutiny that takes place in 1802 in Dominica takes place amid rumours that the regiment is to be disbanded, that the men are going to be forced back to being enslaved and to work on plantations. And the fact that the men had their weapons taken from them and they'd been given cutlasses and hoes, and that the additional money that they should have been paid for that kind of non-military service is at best patchy in terms of the payments, only lends credence to these kind of fears. In other words, when the men of that regiment feared that there was a threat to their martial status, they mutiny. These mutinies were the exception, however, and the broader success, I think, of army discipline and the power exerted by military spectacle was evident in the fact that throughout most of their history, the vast majority of their history, the men of the West India Regiments did their duty, soldiering, killing, and dying for the British Empire. However unpalatable you might find that, that's a fact. So the military spectacle of the West India Regiments was also intended to send a message about how they should be viewed by others, and thus took on considerable significance in the societies in which they served. As I said, military symbolism, the uniform and these other martial symbols differentiated the soldiers from the civilian population. And when that non-military population was a majority enslaved population, in societies characterized by stark racial hierarchies, their military spectacle was a significant and, in my opinion, greatly underappreciated element in the kind of visual culture of these societies. And the book is very visual, and I must say I'm very grateful to Cambridge University Press for allowing me to include quite so many images in the book. In these kind of circumstances, the West India Regiment soldier could become a deeply threatening figure for the social racial order for white colonists. In the early years of the regiments in particular, white West Indians expressed concerns not only about the existence of the regiments, but also about their appearance. And they were worried that they would be a kind of a revolutionary sight that would stir enslaved people to take up arms by seeing almost like the world reversed. And along with raising doubts about the extent to which the soldiers could be trusted, in which they'd internalised their martial value, there were frequent calls in the early 19th century for these soldiers to be confined to remote sites almost out of the way, where they wouldn't threaten the visual regime of slavery. The military spectacle of the West India Regiments also circulated more broadly within wider discourses of empire, as their image was represented visually in newspapers, in compendia of military uniforms, and in occasional works of art. This is probably, until relatively recently, the most famous image of the West India Regiments, the one that's on the screen now. This is the front cover for Roger Buckley's Slaves in Redcoats. And this is the one that people often use when they want to illustrate them. This comes from a compendium from the mid 1810s, by Charles Hamilton Smith. But this kind of image is also expressed not just visually, but also in print by officers, by special correspondence, and it's also viewed by members of public when the men were on parade. And one of the things that the book tries to do, and I'll just kind of briefly show you the contents page, is it kind of tries to track this image across the long 19th century. So a lot of work has tended to focus on the very beginning of the regiments in the revolutionary Caribbean. But the book, what I wanted to do was go beyond that. And basically the chapters, the core of the book is in kind of three substantive pairs. So chapters 2 and 3 are about the revolutionary Caribbean. Chapters 4 and 5 are about kind of mid-Victorian Britain, where you see the kind of expansion of print culture, particularly visual print culture, and how the regiments fit in there. The focus there also shifts towards West Africa, as the focus of the regiments did too. And then the final two core chapters of 6 and 7 are about the place of the regiments in the kind of era of high imperialism, the kind of expanding violent European presence in the continent of Africa, and the reflection of that in kind of cultures of militarism in Britain, particularly around the Diamond Jubilee of 1897. So the book then, by doing so, by sort of looking at this long 19th century, the book kind of looks at how the image of the West India Regiment personnel related to wider debates about people of African descent across this period. And this is evident in, say, in the early decades, when the way in which the regiments have been thought about and talked about is entangled with what Catherine Hall calls the war of representation. So I'm sure people in this call will know what I'm talking about, but she's referring there to the kind of the circulation of pro and anti-slavery images from the sort of 1780s onwards into at least into the 1830s, and then there's something of an afterlife beyond that, in which kind of counter images of kind of people of African descent are being circulated by opponents and supporters of slavery. And of course, as we all know, this is the famous anti-slavery one. And as, again, we all know, in seeking to kind of contest pro-slavery ideas about racial difference, and the abolitionists end up creating a whole new stereotype, which evokes a kind of passivity, a white savior complex, that sort of suggests that people of African descent should be grateful for the freedom that's been granted to them. And many people have kind of talked about this kind of work. As such, both pro and anti-slavery sides participated in a war of representation that involved producing images of people of African descent that was distinct from the realities of those people's lives, but still had consequences for them. Now, again, people who've read any of my earlier work, that idea of a war of representation is one I found useful previously. Of course, when we start thinking about a war of representation and then think about the place of military figures within that, for me, the term takes on a kind of an additional charge. And this is because one of the elements of kind of pro-slavery discourse in the late 18th, early 19th century is the dangerous figure, is the feared figure of the rebellious person of African descent, usually male. And this is an image people will recognize from Brian Edwards' history. This is a maroon associated with the Second Maroon War, Anglo-Maroon War of 1795. And at the same time, there are other images in circulation, obviously some associated with the Haitian Revolution, because the British intervened in that between 1793 and 1798. And I already mentioned, there's a wider kind of discourse around the brigand, which is how essentially opposite, self-liberating people of African descent get called by the British brigands in St. Vincent in San Lucie in Grenada. And this is this kind of dangerous armed black man, essentially, is this kind of figure. But if the black brigand is the kind of stuff of white pro-slavery nightmares, how does the West India Regiment fit in with that? And indeed, an important argument I try to make in the book is that just as kind of broader pro and anti-slavery representations are circulating in this period, so too are images of black martial figures. And that these are also part of this war of representation. So in some ways, these two are being counterposed against one another. The dangerous man of African descent and the civilized soldier. And of course, this figure is very, very different. We can begin to think about some of the differences between the two sorts of images, which will be fairly obvious. But the second set of images, the kind of West India Regiment, the images of that are associated not with anti-slavery campaigners specifically, but rather with military and colonial governmental staff, for whom the West India Regiments represented a solution to Britain's military crisis in the Caribbean. And one of the arguments I make in the book is that when we think about the creation of the West India Regiments, the establishment of the West India Regiments, that wasn't just a kind of a military act or a political act or legal act. It's also a cultural act. The West India Regiments almost have to be imagined into existence and continue to be imagined as a kind of possibility. To put it another way, a war of representation is fought over the West India Regiments. There are kind of pro and anti-regiment discourses. But just as the abolitionists ended up producing a new stereotype of the kind of passive, grateful figure who's been given freedom, which of course had very little to do with the realities for these people on the ground. Likewise, this other image, this imagining of the West India Regiment, also creates a new kind of stereotype from the start. And in the book, I call this the steady black soldier. And the steady black soldier has kind of three elements that you can see repeated again and again and again. The first one is the way in which they're imagined as kind of their kind of tropicality. So the number of times, here's another image, the palm tree is always there, including in bizarre images where there are images of these soldiers in Kent doing kind of rifle training, and there are palm trees there as well. Secondly, the idea that these soldiers are almost always represented as passive. It's very, very, very hard to find written or visual descriptions of the soldiers doing very much fighting. Instead, they're just shown sort of standing there. And the third one is they're often shown standing there, being inspected, either by other figures around them, as with this one, which is the other possibly earliest image of the regiments, or by us, the viewer. So if you go back to that, we're doing the expecting. In other words, the martial value of these men is never secure. It's constantly being kind of invited to be assessed and reassessed. So after the formal ending of slavery, the question about the nature of nature of blackness remains a crucial one. It's a kind of a theme that has been explored by many historians. The refusal of formerly enslaved people to conform to anti-slavery expectations in the Caribbean leads some in Britain to view emancipation as a failure, which contributes to the hardening of British attitudes around race from the 1840s onwards. The war of representation thus extends beyond the immediate issue of British involvement in slavery, and also and gets instead caught up with kind of wider debates about emancipation, as well as with blending with the kind of emergence of scientific racism from the 1850s. And West India Regiment soldier as a type, as a figure, continues to feature in this field, not least because its personnel actively participated in defending and expanding Britain's presence in Africa. Questions about race and military capability coalesced during the so-called small wars that Britain fought in the last decades of the 19th century, as well as in the solidification of ideas around the kind of so-called martial races. The men of the West India Regiments are never thought of in those terms. They're never thought of as a martial race, though. And moreover, as the Caribbean declined in relative importance within the British Empire as a whole, the units themselves became increasingly marginalised elements of the British Army. And as such, while their initial creation was a kind of desperate military innovation during the Age of Revolutions, the consequences of that desperation are slowly unpicked over the next few decades, over the long 19th century. So let me illustrate what I mean. Consider, for example, the depiction of the first African Caribbean soldier and first African Caribbean man to receive the Victoria Cross, Samuel Hodge. Private Samuel Hodge of the 4th West India Regiment. In 1866, his regiment was serving in West Africa when it was involved in an assault against a stockaded village close to the River Gambia. And for his bravery in breaching the stockaded village's defences, he was awarded Britain's highest military honour, though he dies of his wounds not long after in 1868. And Hodge is depicted in a variety of ways, most famously in this painting, which is called The Capture of Tubabakalonga, Gambia, 1866, by the English artist Louis William Desonge. And Desonge at the time was well known as a kind of society portrait painter, but also particularly for his paintings of winners of the Victoria Cross, mainly from the Crimean War and the First War of Indian Independence. And these are on display at the Crystal Palace. They're reproduced in printed form. They're circulating as kind of like lantern shows. These are probably the most well-known image of kind of contemporary warfare in mid-Victorian Britain. And Desonge is a kind of crucial figure, although he's been overlooked by art historians. He's not Lady Butler. And there are interesting reasons why Desonge has been overlooked. But he's a kind of a key figure in the emergence of a kind of middle-class British militarism. And the chapter looks at the depiction of Hodge in Desonge's painting, comparing it to other of Desonge's works, but also at kind of wider written descriptions about Hodge, and shows just how marginalized Hodge gets in a story that's supposedly about him. So you will all know, of course, which one Hodge is from this painting, I'm sure. But when I've shown this painting, which is in a museum in Penzance, and we brought it to London a few years ago for the Museum of London Docklands, when I've said to people cold, this is a painting of a Victoria Cross winner, pointing them out, they all point to the white man with the beard. It's of course not. It's the man kneeling by his side, giving him a gun. That's Samuel Hodge. And we have this kind of like the arguments I make, and yes, whether Desonge is deliberately evoking the am I not a man and brother, or just sort of accidentally, subconsciously evoking that, there's an open question. But what I argue is that the idea of the West India Regiments as kind of steady black soldiers constrains the way in which their actual acts of military heroism can be represented. So they're constantly rendered in this kind of passive way. And these kind of questions of representation also had implications on the battlefield itself. So the West India Regiments participated in the 1873-74 Anglo-Ashanti War, which is the first kind of colonial campaign that Britain fights in Africa that really captures the public imagination. It's the campaign that makes a household name of the commanding officer in the second part of the war, Garnet Joseph Wolseley. So the very model of a modern Major General, that guy, the guy who will eventually become head of the British Army. And what I show in that chapter is that the Ashanti had beaten the British on more than one occasion before the 1870s, and they'd taken a kind of particularly important place within not just British but other wider European discourses as kind of this very dangerous savage enemy in West Africa. And the war gets cast by Wolseley, the commanding officer, and people around him, and by the special correspondents, the newspaper writers who accompany the second part of the war, the expedition, the second part of the war. The war gets cast as a kind of race war, where white British soldiers have to humble this long-standing, dangerous African enemy, the Ashanti. But of course, that completely ignores the fact that the West India Regiments had been involved in the war from the beginning. For the first half of the war, there's white soldiers on the ground. It's the West India Regiment men who are doing the fighting. And they get written out of the story. They don't really fit into the overall narrative, which pits kind of like white soldiers against black warriors, which is essentially the way in which the war is understood. And that has consequences on the ground. It's not just kind of discursive here. when the expedition eventually, basically Ashanti marched south and then marched back north towards Kumasi, and the British followed them. Wolseley leads this expedition following them. And in that march north to Kumasi, the West India Regiment soldiers, who remember are professional members of the British Army, are converted to baggage handlers to carry the gear of the white soldiers. Their rations are cut. And when eventually the British Expeditionary Force reaches the Ashanti capital, Kumasi, black soldiers aren't allowed to enter. Only white soldiers enter Kumasi, which is the image you've got in front of you. And the West India Regiment soldiers are kept out in what people at the time saw as a deliberate slight, which told you exactly how the kind of key military officers thought about them. Now this, I'll bring things towards an end. The kind of final chapter moves on, the final substantive chapter looks at the way in which there are efforts in the 1880s, 1890s to sort of get down a history of the regiments now that they're approaching being their centenaries. And the first book-length histories of the regiments date from this period and are written by men who'd been junior officers during the Anglo-Ashanti War of 1873-74. And I particularly, in that chapter, I'm particularly interested in the kind of the ambivalent place of the West India regiments in the Diamond Jubilee of 1897, where 12 soldiers come to Britain. They're accompanied by loads of other soldiers from across the British Empire. Basically, the 1897 Diamond Jubilee is just a big, massive military and naval. It's like it's a kind of pre-Anglo-Boer War celebration of Britain's martial greatness. Essentially, that's what 1897 is all about. And the regiment, where the West India Regiments fit in, or the one remaining West India Regiment fit in, is really, really interesting. Because even though they're part of the British Army, they never get to march with the British Army. And they're always kept basically at the back with the rest of the other soldiers from around the Empire, behind the Canadians, behind the Australians, behind the Indian Army, sort of at the back somewhere. The men themselves who come over include another Victoria Cross winner, a guy called Sergeant William James Gordon, who's quite a famous figure, photographed figure. Former PhD student of mine, Melissa Bennett, has kind of done work on the kind of photographic image of Gordon. And one interesting thing is that the accounts we have of the time, including in the press, suggest that the men are very proud. The West India Regiment representatives are very proud of their place in this parade. But the press coverage is kind of very sneering and saying, like, these men hold themselves up as if they, the whole empire rests on their backs, and who do they think they are? And there's this constant, like, sneering, sniping tone in the press. Daily Mail is founded in 1896 and hits straight to the ground running. This kind of like, who do they think they are? They think they're more important than they are. And the other thing that's interesting you see around the Diamond Jubilee is there are a couple of moments when the West India Regiments become this kind of focal point from a series of discussions around the relationship between race and empire and status and military value and so forth. So, for example, there's a major military parade that takes place in Aldershot, which is much more limited to like, it's for the military rather than for a wider public. And in that parade, the West India Regiment soldiers march at the front of the infantry, in front of a whole series of white soldiers from across the British Empire. And the press coverage says this was seen as a slight. The Australians, white soldiers, were horrified they had to walk behind black soldiers. And the press is kind of saying, why are we doing this? Why are we upsetting the racial sensibilities of our white soldiers who we should kind of pander to this? We shouldn't make them walk behind black soldiers. So the West India Regiments constantly serve as this kind of like sort of linchpin for these kind of debates and anxieties and ambiguities, even as they're being systematically marginalized. I'll move towards an end. At the end of the book, one of the things I tried to do again, which I don't think hasn't been done before, is I tried to think about the kind of commemorative afterlives of the regiments. What happens after they're eventually disbanded in 1927, how they've been remembered, and in most cases have not been remembered. When the National Army Museum, which I'd be interested to know if anyone has been to it the last few years since it reopened, the West India Regiments actually had quite an interesting prominent place in the rejuvenated National Army Museum from 2017, because they tell us such an interesting and rather different story about how we think of the history of the British Army. Purchasing this painting was one of the reasons why they wanted to get that, was because they wanted to tell a slightly different story about the British Army. There's been more recently another kind of redevelopment, and that presence has been kind of scaled back. But it's interesting again how this image and these regiments kind of occupy this slightly ambiguous space. And that brings me to where I'll finish. And this is a kind of further interesting example of the kind of, I'd say, the kind of commemorative afterlives of the West India Regiments. So towards the end of last year, an audio trail, which some of you may have participated in, if you haven't, I'd strongly recommend it. An audio trail was put together at St. Paul's Cathedral, and it's basically a collaboration between an African Caribbean heritage and arts organisation called St. Vincent's and the Grenadines Second Generation, SV2G, and also some of my colleagues here at Warwick in our French department, Kate Asprey and Abigail Cobbins. And what this audio trail does is it recontextualizes a series of monuments at St. Paul's to British military and naval figures who served in the Caribbean. So, John Moore, Robert Falconer, Ralph Abercrombie, Thomas Picton, all these people are buried, and others are buried at St. Paul's. And the audio trail essentially explains basically what these men were doing in the Caribbean in the 1790s and early 1800s, what they actually meant to be fighting in the West Indies. And this is the kind of this is the imagery that's used to promote this trail, and it's very interesting. So we have the West India Regiment soldier, obviously based on that painting, and he's in a rather interesting pantheon of figures. I'm sure some people can sort of tell me who these people are. We've got Chocoyer, we've got Delgarès, we've got Nani, we've got Solitude, and I think the figure on the other figure is probably based on the Emancipation statue, the Buster statue in Barbados. And then in the middle, we've got this West India Regiment soldier. And the interesting is, because the other 5 figures are all people who, without doubt, fought against the British in different sorts of ways. Some of them fought against the French as well, but they all definitely fought against the British. Whereas the West India Regiment soldier, in a sense, is a counter-revolutionary figure. He's he's the people they opposed. But that then brings us again to the ambiguity, because I said that this is an image of a member of the 8th West India Regiment, dating from maybe 1802, 1803. That was the regiment that mutinied in Dominica, the very first mutiny that took place amongst the West India Regiments. And we don't know, because we can't quite date it, is this an image of one of the men who mutinied? Is this an image of a man who stayed loyal and fought against the mutineers? Is this a man who was somewhere in the Caribbean with his regiments and had nothing to do with it? Or, less excitedly, is this a member of the 11th West India Regiment, which then gets renumbered the 8th West India Regiment when that unit gets disbanded? We don't know. But I think what that speaks to is that an image like this is quite a complex one, very ambiguous one. And that's why I chose it for my front cover. So I'll leave it there. Thanks, Eve.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Can we give David a virtual round of applause, please? Let's just, David, can you stop your screen share as well? And
I can.
to the Q&A.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Right. Yeah, fantastic book, fantastic talk. And I've put the code for you in the link to the book, so please do check that out. Has anybody got an initial question they would like to start to kick off with? Please raise your hand or wave at me. Nobody? I thought maybe Kate, you might want to say something because David mentioned the exhibition. I don't want to put you on the spot.
I'm happy to talk. If no one else has a question, then it's the members of St. Vincent and the Grenadines Second Generation who chose the imagery for the cathedral project. So they very much wanted figures who would represent the variety of perspectives on the wars in the Caribbean. I think that what we're trying to do above all else is show just how very complex things are, and not to simplify matters, but to actually show how deeply complicated, who chooses to fight on which side and how and when. I was looking at some documentation about the Garifuna who were removed from St. Vincent and sent to Ballysore and then onto Roatan. And there's a list of the enslaved Africans they own. which complicates the story, and then some of them are sent back to St Vincent and some are not. And wherever we look in the Caribbean in this 1790s period, people are making some really complicated choices, and that's what the imagery that David's been sharing with us shows so very nicely, that we don't know very much about any of the figures or the portraits of any of the people that David's been showing us, but that actually we shouldn't try and simplify their stories and say this is clearly someone who was fighting for the British, or this was clearly someone who rebelled against the British. Actually, we need to try and be able to hold the possibility that both of those could coexist, and potentially in the same individual. So that's the nice thing about some of the imagery, is that yes, we don't know who they are, but actually it allows us to hold that complexity in a really interesting way.
And I think I would 100% agree with you. Obviously, Kate, I didn't see you in the chat, so I didn't want to embarrass you, but I didn't know who was here, basically. But you actually completely agree with you, of course. And the point is, as you know as well, is that people at the time were very uncertain about who was on whose side. I mean, this is such a kind of context of kind of shifting loyalties and people moving from one position to another. The fact that former adversaries will then, after British eventually succeed in ending the kind of counterinsurgency in San Lucie, some of those people they've been fighting, in the woods, become West India Regiment soldiers, shipped out to Africa and this kind of stuff. So they're kind of shifting parameters. Not everyone never been quite certain on the loyalties of other people, and they've kind of got doubts that are being expressed. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting. It's one of the reasons why it's such a fascinating time and place.
Great. Any questions? People are quite shy today. Usually people jump in with a lot of questions. Right. I really liked when you said you talked about not being a military historian. I think my question, part of it would be, what defines a military historian? Because because a lot of that I think is very much, it's very important to understand this history, isn't it? And as you said, but it's too important to be left just to the military historian. So one I think was what defines a military historian, or are we really talking about military history? What else are we talking about? And the other question I had for you was, you did talk about the archives, and you talked about people being, the voices of the soldiers kind of not being there, but what voices did you find, any evidence, if any, of their day-to-day lives and of their day-to-day experiences? Was there anything that you found that would help us learn more about these people as individuals and in their own, and you talked through the different motivations as well they might have had for joining. I can't remember whose book you mentioned, somebody's book there who kind of listed what the motivations were. Can you think of any others as well of why people might have become involved in the military?
Yeah, I'll put that in the chat in a minute, Eve, the name of the book. So let me start with maybe the second substantive question first, and I'll go back to the military history one. I mean, there are, in some ways, this is just the kind of the same challenge that historians who work on societies where there is slavery, it's the same problem, in that often the times when we might have something that amounts to a voice, it's often in the form of testimony, because it's like a courts-martial or something. And then in the same way, we wouldn't rely on those things to tell, when people are being tortured and forced to confess and all these sorts of things. So you do get moments like that. There's a really interesting the second mutiny takes place in 1808 in Jamaica, and there's a little bit of some of the kind of sources, if you look at that, when they're kind of trying to understand what's going on and they're kind of trying to get to the bottom of it, you get a sense of kind of the way in which the men of the West India Regiments are moving beyond the kind of space of the barracks, interacting within, I guess, what we might always think about in Julius S. Scott's term, the kind of common wind, like drinking with other people, gambling with other people, like hanging out. And you get a sense of the kind of like the soldiers at the interface of kind of civilian life. And so you get these little moments like that. I do think things like the mutiny of 1808 is an interesting one, because one of the other factors that's used to explain why that happened, as I say, there's certain basically forms of mistreatment by the the kind of the commanding officer who's a right, he's a proper bad one. But also there are rumors, because this is during the kind of the brief moments of peace between the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, and the men there are some kind of descriptions of women telling the men that the regiment is going to be disbanded. So again, you just get these little hints. And likewise, if you look at sources, like there are certain order books that the National Army Museum holds, which are kind of like general orders given to men for like the soldiers, of what they ought to do and like how they're supposed to behave. And they, in a sense, like in that kind of like Foucauldian way, when you see a law in place, it's telling you about what's potentially not what ought to be happening rather than what is happening. So there's often, you get little hints of kind of like washerwomen, being in the barracks. And again, there's an emerging literature in kind of so-called new military history around kind of the presence of so-called camp followers. And, there's clearly interactions. One of the things that planters complain about in the Caribbean, so this is all during the period of slavery. Obviously, things do change when slavery is formally ended in the British Caribbean. The regiments continue. Is planters complain about things like the men of the regiments coming onto the estates and stirring up jealousies between enslaved men and enslaved women. Now, how much you can rely on some of that stuff, how much that's kind of like, that tells you about the kind of the psychoses or whatever of kind of, white enslavers. But there's hints like that. The question around kind of military history, what is it? I mean, you're right, absolutely right. In a sense, there's a kind of cliched version. I mean, there are some fantastic military historians of this period. Hugh Davies, Wandering Army, his book is brilliant. There are people who've done really, really good, thoughtful work that's recognizable military history, but is not. I think that the bad military history is the decontextualized stuff where people become obsessed with the kind of details of certain things. Although, of course, one of the things about this book is I was actually very interested in the details of uniforms, and I spent a lot of time trying to understand some of that stuff with drill and things like that. I think the problem is that what we need is a kind of, and where this work has happened best, where we've got kind of more social and cultural contextualized forms of military history, it's primarily been on the 20th century. So it's a lot of World War II stuff and some World War I stuff, but taking it all the way back to the kind of the revolutionary period, which is what I want to do. There's not as much work there. Taking that then across the Atlantic and doing it in the Caribbean, that's almost like a subset of a subset of a subset. But I think there's a real lot of potential. I talked to the last SCS. I think Steve might have asked the question then. I've been doing some work on John Moore when he's left in charge of St. Lucia. And these are really rich sources, and they really give insights into some of the things that are really having a huge impact. These aren't just like little events that are outside the grand sweep of social economic history. These are really, really important. And that's why I think when I say military history is too important to be left to military historians, I probably also mean, military history is too important to be ignored by historians of the Caribbean too. I think we've not really done it, and I think we need to, because I think there's the sources there. Armies are usually quite good at counting things and keeping records and stuff like that. And if we are interested in kind of histories of violence, histories of emotions, histories of the environment, histories of, and so forth, then I think the kind of space of the military and, the title that of my current project, thinking about insurgency and counterinsurgency, brigandage and repression together, I think that's the kind of direction I think we go, and I think there's a lot of potential in that kind of area. And then this Kate's project shows there's a lot of, these are also things that kind of are of wider interest. These kind of commemorative histories speak to people.
Fantastic. I can see that Steve's had his hand up for a while, so we'll go to Steve next. And then we've had a number of questions in the chat. If I disappear at any point, it's because I've got a 4-year-old. But there's questions that start with Silu, and we can read the way down, but I will try and make it back. So Steve, can you ask your question first, and then we'll work our way through the ones in the chat?
Yeah, I'm interested in what you were saying about before the end of enslavement, that many of most of the soldiers were purchased, and that kind of compulsion. But I'm also thinking, how does that relate to the kind of general compulsion of conscription into the British Army, of press gangs, of military flogging throughout the whole of the Army and Navy at the time, and probably much later than we actually thought. Sort of, I wonder, if you thought about how that relates to the whole general element of compulsion within the army. And just one point, you showed us a picture of the final picture of the soldier dressed in a kind of imitation of French military, I think. I think there's also the way the French army used African troops right up to the Second World War. 3/4 of de Gaulle's Free French were either from Chad or Morocco, but he was desperate to make sure that they couldn't, that when Leclerc's division got to Paris, they were white men in it, to the extent that he actually allowed Spanish anarchists to drive the tanks rather than black or than black Africans. So that made me wonder about, when you were saying about how they were turned into baggage handlers and things like that, how that use of soldiers, but then how they, people don't want to be seen as being a significant part of the victory.
Yeah. So you're absolutely right, Steve, about the point about compulsion and like, let's think about violence and so forth. I mean, there is the book I've just put in the chat, Eric Jan Zerker's Fighting for a Living, which is an edited collection, which has got a really neat introduction that Zerker talks about. Basically, he argues that Labour historians have tended to overlook soldiers and have tended to think about soldiers as essentially like anti-workers because of obviously their role in kind of repressing and maintaining the kind of power of the state or whatever the authorities might be. But therefore have kind of, because of that, have tended to like not think about them in relation to the same sorts of questions we might ask about workers. And I think beginning to sort of, so that's the kind of first point to make. The second one is, you're absolutely right. Press ganging, conscription, the kind of the forms of service that all soldiers are being subjected to, not just the kind of violence and the threats of violence, but also the ways these are being militated through essentially heavy drinking by everybody to try and get through the kind of horrors of all this stuff. The West India Regiments are kind of part of the same, they might be a particular manifestation of some of those things, but there is a broader story here. And of course, as you know, Steve, that's one of the arguments that's made by supporters of slavery, is to say, well, the life of a redcoat, the violence meted out to soldiers in this are enslaved people much worse? And of course, that's not a good faith argument they're making. Of course, it's done in bad faith. The thing that's different about the West India Regiments, that's always there, is that when they are subjected, you see forms of kind of military discipline to which they're subjected beyond the kind of normal things that all soldiers are subjected to in the British Army, is the reduction of people to essentially pioneers or labouring units. In other words, the stripping of their kind of military status, including the pay and all the things that come with that, and essentially reduction to effectively like corvée labour or enslaved labour working for the army. That's never something that's done to, I mean, you've got like forlorn units, criminal type units and stuff, but not on the same scale. So there's always that extra dimension there. That it's the kind of thing about more generally about the stories around kind of manumission and the way in which people, if you've got a situation where there is racialized slavery, then anyone who can be thought of as racially other is always vulnerable in some way to kind of attack on their status, to being, forced to prove something that other people, that white people aren't. So there's that extra dimension, I think, that would add the general stories around compulsion and violence that's definitely part of military life in this period. The French, yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right. One of the things I try to do is there's more work on the kind of French cases, and I try to think about there are some parallels between what the British are doing, what the French are doing, how the British will copy. I mean, obviously, very directly in the 1790s, the British military innovation to create the regiments is to go, oh my God, look what Victor Hugo has done. We're no longer fighting French regulars, which we can try to intercept with Royal Navy ships. We're now basically fighting the self-liberated population and the gens de couleur. We're now massively outnumbered by people who are very, very committed to their freedom. So we've got to do something in response. And you see that again, like the creation of the French army in Africa, when obviously the French invade Algeria and expand the imperial presence in there. The British are constantly looking at what the French are doing. And the French case is a more complicated one because of you see similar relations between kind of slavery and freedom and military service, which goes up to 1848 and then beyond 1848 in the kind of French West and North Africa. But yeah, the British never ever do. I mean, obviously, you're absolutely right about de Gaulle, but at the end of the First World War, there are black French soldiers who I think are involved. I mean, they're involved in a way in Europe that the British never ever do that with their soldiers of African descent. They keep them in more kind of they keep them fighting in other theatres, or in the case of the British West Indies Regiment, they give them other kind of like labouring roles. So although the French are also racially queasy about this. As you with the Gaulle, they're more willing to do that, possibly because, well, probably because much more of their armed force is coming from the continent of Africa itself. It's far, far more significant kind of French imperial force than people of African descent are as a proportion to British imperial military overall, I would say.
Okay, fantastic. We've had so I can see Scylla has asked 2 questions in the chat, so I might merge those together if that's okay, just for keeping time. So the first question is, was the opportunity to have employment the only factor enduring black men who joined the regiment? And also, is there any evidence of West Indian soldiers changing sides and joining the opposition in the 3 main revolts or mutinies?
Okay, so obviously when we talk about employment, that only becomes a possibility with formal emancipation. And after formal emancipation, the West India Regiments do recruit, particularly in Barbados and Jamaica, which probably wouldn't surprise people. There are people who, there are opportunities in the same way that any, again, the Zerka book talks about this. Many young men join the army, not necessarily all about volition and agency, might be about desperation and no other options, but they do continue to recruit in the Caribbean from amongst the civilian population. Over time, the kind of relative status of the regiments declines and the numbers drop as well. Like, for example, by the time of the First World War, the one remaining West India Regiment isn't particularly high status anymore. A lot of the sorts of men who might have joined the West India Regiments, joined the British Army, are the sorts of men who are going to Panama and stuff like that. It's that kind of thing. That there are other opportunities for British African Caribbean people in the wider Caribbean region in the relation to kind of US capital and stuff like that. The West India Regiment. So by that point, the West India Regiment is not a particularly highly regarded employment option. The question around changing sides. Okay, so we need to distinguish between 2 things here. Obviously, with the mutinies, the 3 mutinies, 1802, 1808, 1837, these involve West India Regiment soldiers. They're not particularly big mutinies. They're nothing like, don't think about the Indian First War of Independence. They're nothing of that scale. If we're talking about the 3 revolts against slavery in the British Caribbean, so Barbados, Demerara, and Jamaica, they're not involved in Jamaica in 1831-32. There are no West India Regiment forces. Well, there's a tiny handful, but nothing significant in Jamaica at that time. They are involved in both Barbados in 1816 and Demerara in 1823, and on both occasions, they are part of the counter-revolutionary forces. They are actively suppressing the rebellions, the insurgency. There's a fascinating moment in 1816 in Barbados where there's a particularly important engagement takes place in that in what's called Buster's Rebellion, where West India Regiment soldiers march up to a group of self-liberated enslaved people, and the insurgents cheer them, thinking they're going to join them, exactly as the question suggests, and they don't, and they open fire and disperse the insurgents. The West India Regiment troops are also involved in the suppression of the Morant Bay Rebellion, and some of them very, very violently. So, most of the time, in fact, all the time, they never ever join, they never cross sides ever.
Great. I'll do my very best to get through all these questions. Joe asks, how have military historians received the book?
That's a nice question. Well, this is slightly bizarre. I just got an email from a somewhat famous military historian who said the book's been shortlisted for a couple of prizes. So make of that what you will. I don't know. I'm sure it depends. I'm sure there'll be people who will tell me all the things I've got wrong. That person's not doing that maneuver. They're actually doing this maneuver. That's wrong. That's not what you call that thing. You call it this. I'm sure there'll be some of that. I'm not particularly interested in that. In some ways, it's the sort of reaction I might get from, as I say, people like Hugh Davies, the kind of military historians who have a kind of a broader, the sort of people who are publishing books in the Manchester University Press series, the Heather Salt Streeters of the world, those sorts of people who've kind of crossed the military imperial boundary. I don't know. That's the sort of people I'm much more interested in what they're saying, rather than people who will point out all the things I got wrong. That's the honest answer.
Great. Imra is asking, what role do you think the regiments might have played in the formations in Caribbean societies between around 1838 and 1914?
Oh, what a great question. Well, I think that's a big one. I'm going to give you two answers, I think, and tell me. I'll be interested in what you think. The first one is what I've already said, is that there is no doubt the West India Regiments are part of they're one of the means through which the transition from unfreedom to formal freedom takes place. They are part of the police force. And obviously you get the creation of formal police forces later on. Many of whom are ex-West India Regiment soldiers. But they are part of that. So you see in the 1840s and 1850s up to and including Jamaica 1865, the West India Regiment units being used to suppress, to put down kind of potential civilian unrest. They're also fighting in Belize on the kind of borders there. So they're also involved in the kind of defense/expansion. So they're part of that story about them, one of the tools of the imperial state. And then a second sort of sub-story is one of the interesting questions that's always there from the early years of the West India Regiments is basically the men serve for three terms of 7 years. 7 years you sign up again, 7 years sign up again. The West India Regiment men have to do all 21 years. The question is, what do you do with an ex-soldier? And then the question is, what do you do with an ex-soldier of African descent in a society with slavery, with a majority of people of African descent? Most Caribbean colonies do not want those people sticking around. But there are some colonies that are, in a sense, labour hungry, and Trinidad is a really interesting example of that, where they're actually encouraging West India Regiment soldiers to move. And there are settlements in Trinidad which they have their origins in kind of like some of these like people leaving the regiments and settling there. So almost like not quite a frontier force, but there's that sort of thing. So it's not a very significant story, but it is a very interesting story about how do you reintegrate these people back into society. And then there would be the main things I would say.
Great. Another one for you on a practical level. What was the relationship between the West India Regiment and other soldiers in the Caribbean, such as the Royal West India Rangers? So that was a white but penal regiment. Would they have been garrisoned together, or were forms of segregation in place within garrisons?
So some of those units do fight with the West India Regiment. So I mentioned the Ashanti Empire having inflicted defeats on the British on a couple of occasions in West Africa. The first Anglo-Ashanti War, the 23-24 war, the one where Charles McCarthy supposedly has his skull taken, basically. The West India regiments are fighting with some of these penal units, the ones that you mentioned exactly. The interesting thing is that if you look at the kind of visual depiction of that event, there were no black soldiers anywhere near it. They're all just portrayed as if they're all white soldiers doing the fighting, which maybe tell us nothing. It may just tell us something about the ignorance of the artist in question. So they were fighting together. Generally in the Caribbean, because I mentioned this kind of like desire to almost like manage their kind of potentially disruptive presence, they tend to be the units that get put in the unhealthy, mosquito-ridden, older crumbling forts. They stick them over there and then have the white soldiers distinct from them. And you've got in general, most of the Caribbean in the kind of early 19th century, there's this general plan where they try and maintain a ratio of kind of 2 white soldiers to every black soldier. In different colonies, it doesn't often quite work that way, and certainly not if you take into account healthy soldiers. But they generally, as far as I'm aware, tend to be pushed to these kind of more marginal sites, and not just all barracked together in the same kind of way. But they do on some occasions fight together.
Okay, and another question from Silla, but I'm not sure if I understand this one, so please do jump in, Silla, if I'm not doing it justice. But it says, isn't the issue of black men being soldiers, i.e. bearing arms, versus the use of them as labour corps, especially in World War One, seems to me the issue between the West Indian regiments and the BWIR?
The British West Indies Regiment. So, Silla, thank you for that. I'll just quickly clarify for anyone who doesn't, because this is one of the reasons why this is the more bit of the precision bit in me, is that I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about the idea there was just one regiment, there were multiple regiments, and this mixing up. And it's understandable because these terms are very common. But the British West Indies Regiment, which had multiple battalions, is the one that's essentially the volunteer force raised basically in Jamaica that goes out to fight in the First World War. One of the reasons why there was a demand for mainly a lot of middle-class Jamaicans to have this new formation they could join is because they didn't want to serve in the working class one remaining West India Regiment. They wanted to be patriotic volunteers for empire, not professionals in the West India Regiment. Now, the West India Regiment and some battalions, some elements of the British West Indies Regiment are involved in combat roles briefly in West Africa, but mainly in East Africa, where they're fighting East African German forces, essentially. So some elements of the British West Indies Regiment and the West India Regiment are in a fighting role. But later battalions that get raised in the British West Indies Regiment are raised purely as labouring battalions. And some initially, I examined a doctoral thesis about this a few years ago. Initially, it's, we haven't got time to train them yet. We need them on the ground. But that quite quickly moves into a policy of we're never going to train them. We just want them to be labourers. So there are the British West Indies Regiments. There are different battalions with different kind of experiences, which I think we've not always tended to recognise. That's not my specialty, but I can dig out the name of the person who wrote the really wonderful thesis about exactly that really gets to the detail of that. The other thing that's interesting about that is that there's a couple of moments in the East African campaign where the West India Regiment and a battalion of the British West Indies Regiment are both fighting, and there's a desire to stick them together to create the kind of effective fighting units, because they haven't got two smaller units aren't big enough on their own. And the men of the West Indies Regiment do not want that. They do not want to serve with the working class professionals, lower status working class professionals of the West India Regiment.
Great. Has anybody got any additional questions that they want to put to David? Right. Well, I think that was a fantastic session. I'm going to stop recording now. We're getting lots of thank yous coming in.